Welcome back to Photography Discourse. Today I want to talk about the case for Nikon in 2023 and going forward. And what do I mean by the case for Nikon? I mean why I think Nikon is poised and in a great position to become the leader in the hybrid camera market. And by leader, I don't necessarily mean in market share, because market share is largely a function of market numbers that exist, current customers, and so forth. And we know that Canon has many more worldwide users than Nikon, and Sony has many more as well when it comes to the mirrorless market. But I'm talking about in the quality of the product and in both in, I guess the technical quality of the product compared to the competition, and why the Nikons will be the best cameras. And I also want to upfront say I'm sorry about this Band-Aid on my face. I cut myself shaving today, so you have to bear with that. It's not the best look, I know. But basically, let's do a little history here. Going back to 2018, when Nikon released the Z system, they kind of got a bad rap at that time, mostly by YouTubers, but there were some criticisms that were deserved. Some people felt that the original Z6 and Z7 came out in more of a beta form, that they were half-baked, maybe not quite ready to come out, and there were some certain functionality things that were missing that were kind of obviously mistakes, like not having dual card slots and not being able to take a vertical grip and things like that. And those were criticisms I think that were justified. But I also think that there was certain criticisms that were somewhat unjustified. Well, maybe not initially, but as time went on, the autofocus system has been sort of the big criticism of the Nikon Z system from the beginning. And in the beginning, I do think it was behind the times and not up to the standards of Sony at that time. Canon also came out with their RF system around the same time in 2018, and their autofocus at the time wasn't also not very good. But in the second generation of cameras, Canon really stepped it up, and they're fully competitive with Sony at this point. And the second generation of Nikons in the Z6 II and Z7 II, although they were slightly better than the originals, they really didn't fully catch up. They still lagged behind. And it's kind of a controversial topic, I think, because Nikon users who are familiar with the system are able to get very good results out of the Nikon system. It doesn't really hold you back much if you know what you're doing from getting great shots, but it isn't as easy to use, especially, I would say, in the auto area mode. And this is the most sort of idiot-proof mode, where you just put the camera on auto and it selects the AF for you. The Nikon one, compared to the Canon and the Sony, the Nikon one doesn't as intuitively select the subject correctly as intuitively as I would say the Canon and the Sony do. So I'd say in this particular mode, Nikon is a little bit behind, maybe even still. But I would say that with the Z9 coming out, this has been largely rectified. And with all the different modes that Nikon offers, it's a little more of a nuanced autofocus system than the others. So you really kind of need to know which mode to use, but when you do, it works very, very well. And the auto area mode is, from my understanding on the Z9, is now pretty close to the others. Maybe it still lacks behind a little bit in subject selection, auto subject selection, but there's so many better modes to use anyway on Nikon that it's kind of, I don't see that as a big point. It's basically for people who don't really know how to shoot that well. Like that, those are kind of the idiot mode, autofocus mode. So not to say that you're an idiot if you use it, there are use cases for it. Sometimes even with bird in flight, it can be a good one. But in general, I think there's many modes to choose from, and you have to figure out for your particular use case what's the best way to go. So that all said, in looking to the future, why do I say Nikon is poised in a position to be a market leader as far as what is offered in the product? And I think to consider that, we have to think of really this. I'm looking at basically 6 different categories to define that. So the first category I'm looking at is build quality. The second is ergonomics. The third is the menu system. The fourth is the quality of the raw files. The fifth is the Z mount and its lenses. And finally, the sixth is video capabilities. So with those categories in mind, let's consider Nikon in 2023 and moving forward. So first, let's talk about build quality. I think, honestly, anyone who's actually held and used a Nikon camera knows that Nikon has the best build quality of the three top competitors, being Sony, Canon, and Nikon. Sony's honestly feel plasticky and cheap, and the materials that cover the Sony and the grip of the exterior of the camera are very slippery and uncomfortable by comparison to a Nikon. If you're holding a camera all day long, the Nikon it just feels better. The quality of the materials and the feeling of being sort of a well-built machine. Sony's definitely feel more like toys in comparison, or by comparison. And I'd say likewise with the Canon. The Canon's build quality, I think, is a little bit better than Sony potentially, but it's still generally cheaper than Nikon. It still has a plasticky kind of toyish feel. And it's definitely true in the lenses. If you were to take, for example, the Canon RF 50mm 1.2 lens versus the Nikon Z mount 50mm 1.2 S-line lens, they're both phenomenal optics. They both are incredible IQ. They both have incredible IQ, but it's pretty clear that the Canon lens is cheaper, more cheaply built. You can hear it focusing a lot more than the Nikon, and you can see the elements moving in the front, and it's got a little bit more of a chintzy feel by comparison, if you actually feel them side by side. I don't think it's really debatable. It's just factual. You have to just do it for yourself. When it comes to ergonomics, again, I think Nikon is the clear winner. The Sonys, they're much more comfortable to use than Sonys. People with big hands have a lot of trouble using the Sonys. The distance between the grip and the lens, especially with certain bigger wide aperture lenses, is very small. People's fingers get pinched. Definitely not as comfortable to hold, especially if you're shooting all day long at an event or something like that. And I'd say the Canon, well, with the Sony, I also say, even if you have bigger hands, especially, then the Canon or the Sony's going to be quite uncomfortable. And if you're wearing gloves, like in a cold or situation, shooting in the snow or the Arctic, thicker gloves will make it more uncomfortable to use a Sony. The Canon does have a nice grip. I would say the Canon and Nikon grips are virtually equal in terms of comfort. So Canon does a good job there, but as mentioned before, they just are cheaper feeling cameras. In general, they just have a more toyish feel if you hold them side by side. And also, the other major flaw with Canon is their on-off switch is on the left-hand side of the camera, and you need to use, you can't hold the camera and turn it on and off at the same time. And that's a huge ergonomic mistake, I think, and because I'm constantly holding my camera at events and flipping it on and off with my index finger, which is by the shutter button. Sony does that as well, and that's a positive point to both Nikon and Sony. But Canon has this weird on-off button that's out of the way and inconvenient. As far as the menu system goes, I think everyone knows the Sony menu system has been, it's notoriously bad, and in the past has been particularly bad. They've taken steps to improve it in the most recent generations, and from what I can see, it is better, but it still seems to be quite complicated. On this particular point, I think Canon does have the advantage. I think the Canon menu system is perhaps the easiest and most intuitive to use. But the Nikon doesn't lag that far behind. The Nikon, once you know how to use it, which is, I'd say, if you spend a good hour with it and you kind of learn it, once you do, it's pretty intuitive and pretty easy. So although I wouldn't say Nikon has the best menu system and there's room for improvement, I would say that it's right up there and it's close. So it's good enough, I guess. It wouldn't be a mark to me against Nikon or to hold it back from being the sort of the leader of the tech, what this video is about. So The next one is a big one is the quality of the raw files. We're talking like for still images. And the Nikon NEF files are just honestly second to none. They're the best in the business. At least arguably they are. They have excellent dynamic range. They make post-processing both enjoyable and effective. Especially like for dodging and burning, you can just push and pull the files so far, so much farther than other files, and it's really great. And that's how you make your images look good. By the way, dodging and burning, very important. So as compared to Sony, I would say that they're less digital looking than the Sony files, and they display better and truer colors than the Sony files do out of the camera. But mainly the Sony files do have very good dynamic range. I think that might be on par with the NEF files from Nikon, but they're just more digital looking files. There's a digital look to the Sony files that the Nikon has more of a sort of a filmic look overall, I would say. It's subjective, but I think most people agree on this if you really look and compare them. As far as the Canon files go, Nikon has traditionally had a much better dynamic range than the Canon files, the Nikon files do. It's just well known that they do. In recent times, I've actually heard that the RF, or not the RF, excuse me, the Canon R5 files are supposed to be pretty good with their dynamic range and maybe even rivaling the Nikon. I can't speak to this. I haven't really shot the R5, but I have shot the R6 and used the R6, and I've also edited R6 files against Nikon files. And I can tell you definitively that the Z6 II files are much better than the Canon R6 files as far as dynamic range and what you can do with them in post. And it just makes all the difference in the world when you're doing post-production. The Nikon files are excellent, and it's one of the major draws of shooting Nikon. The next category would be the Z mount and its lenses. So the Z mount is, from a physics standpoint, the best mount on the market. It has the widest aperture mouth of 55 millimeters and the shortest flange distance, which is the distance from the rear element of the sensor to, the rear element of the lens to the sensor, of 16 millimeters. So these two things together allow for advanced lens design. It opens up the possibility of making wider aperture lenses and also having less aberration in the actual IQ, less aberrations, less chromatic aberrations, and better edge sharpness because of the physics of how the light bends. I actually have a cursory understanding of this, but I'm not an optical expert. I just know that from the physics standpoint, the closer the flange distance, the better it's going to be for aberration control and edge sharpness. And the wider the mouth, it's going to help with being able to have wider apertures and faster lenses and just more interesting lens design. So Nikon made it a point. They had been using their old F mount since 1959. And in the 80s, when Canon made the wise choice, it turns out, this was one of Canon's positive points, Canon decided to ditch their old mount in 1987 and come out with the EOS system, where they made the mouth of their mount larger, and they did some things to improve. They made it an electrical system where the body and the lens communicated through these electrical contacts, and they did certain things that made their system superior at that time, and that was a smart move. Nikon opted at the time to stick with the F mount and just kind of jury rig it to make it retroactively work with their old lenses, and as a result they kind of fell behind in autofocus because they required body motors in the body as opposed to motors in the lenses, and there were other reasons, but in the end they decided not to change their mount, and they kind of suffered for that. So in 2018, when Nikon finally decided to actually change their mount, I think they really spent some time thinking about this and having their engineers consider what the best possible mount would be from the standpoint of moving forward, and they did declare that their Z mount would be their mount for the next 100 years. And I think that they've shown that through making it the widest opening mouth, 55 millimeters, and the shortest flange distance of the three. The Canon RF has a 54 millimeter mouth, which is close to 55. That's pretty good, but they also have a 20 millimeter flange distance, so the Nikon's actually 20% closer to the sensor, which gives it advantages. And then the Sony mount has an 18 millimeter flange distance is close to 16, so it's probably like a 10% difference. But they have a 48 millimeter mouth, which is very, very small. The Sony E mount was really originally designed to be an APS-C mount, and they kind of jammed a full frame sensor in there. And although Sony marketing claims they can do everything that all the other guys can do with their better mounts, like make 1.2 lenses, which is true, they have made 1.2 lenses, but they aren't really able to do it as well. They have bad focus breathing issues and other sorts of limitations. And I think as time goes forward, they will run into more and more limitations, especially as Nikon and Canon start to push the envelope of their new mounts. The Sony mount likely won't be able to follow. And so at some point they may well have to find themselves changing their mount, at which point they'll be starting over the way Nikon and Canon had to 4 years ago. So for the long haul, I think Sony's got a problem there that they're going to, right now they try to work around it with software. They have breathing compensation built into their software on the camera, but that just crops things in, so you're just losing the true focus distance or focal length of your lens. So it's kind of I mean, cropping to solve the problem to me is not really, you're losing the benefits, so you're not really solving the problem. But suffice to say, the Z mount is clearly the best mount. And along with that comes the Z lenses. The Z lenses have proven to be exceptional lenses from the highest of high end to the lowest of low end. They're just really, really great. Nikon has put out a line of 1.8 professional lenses that nobody else rivals. I did a video about that. One of my last videos is all about that topic, so you can check that out. Their high-end stuff, they're 70 to 200. The new for Z mount, the S line 7200 is phenomenal. Same can be said for the 24 to 70, the 14 to 24. Although I haven't used that one, I do own the other two. But by all accounts, it's exceptional. And of course, their 50 1.2 is just a breathtaking lens. It is large and heavy, but unlike the Sony, it doesn't focus breathe, and it's just an exceptional lens. So going forward, I expect Z mount lenses to just continue to shine, and even at the low end, the 40 millimeter f2 lens, it's not an S line Z mount lens, but it's a Z mount native lens, it's $250 or so if you get it on sale, so it's maybe $75 more than the Canon RF 1.8 50 millimeter, but it smokes that lens. Both in IQ and the fact that it doesn't breathe, and the Canon lens is a bad breather. So all across the board, from more inexpensive to expensive, the Z lenses are just top of the game, top of class, at worst equal to the best competitor, but in many cases better, and they'll continue to be better. So again, that's another positive for the future. And then video capabilities, that was always a point where Nikon had fallen way short in the past. The DSLR days, Nikon's video was really, really bad, at least in terms of autofocus. I think the quality of their files were fine, but it was impossible to really have the camera track somebody, and you had to be pulling focus essentially. Those days are over. They've solved that with the Z system. The Nikon, the autofocus on the video for Nikon is actually extremely good. I'd say it's right there with Sony and Canon. I mean, who's actually better is subjective, but none of them are enough better that it actually really matters at all. And as far as what the video cameras can do, that Nikon has proven with their Z9, which is the best hybrid camera in existence to this day, which is a little more than a year after it came out. It has all the raw codecs in it, and all the 10-bit, and it's got the waveforms, and it's basically a second to none video camera. So when that video tech is trickling down, along with that, the superior autofocus of the Z9 into the newer bodies, which are coming out this year. And as I make this video, by the way, it's January 3rd of 2023, so CES is about to launch in 2 days, and maybe we'll get an announcement there. And CP Plus, I think, is next month, so we expect by then we'll have an announcement. We expect new bodies this year, probably a Z8, which I'm very much looking forward to, and also probably a Z6 III at some point, also looking very much forward to. One for my portraiture, the Z8, and the other for event photography, probably for the Z6 III, because it's a little bit smaller. But these cameras, I expect them to have autofocus that's fully competitive with Canon and Sony. And by fully competitive, I mean 98, 99% of the way. Like if there's some subtle nuance that makes the other better, it actually doesn't matter for how I'd be shooting, or just about how anybody shoots, because like I said, once you know the system, you're able to make it work, and when it's that close, it won't matter. And then as far as everything else, as we went through the list of all these things, everything else, Nikon's pretty much superior already. So their new cameras certainly will continue that in terms of build quality, in terms of ergonomics. Again, the menu being sufficient, the quality of the raw files still being top of class, the mount and the lenses being top of class, and the video capabilities being top of class at this point. Certainly in the Gen 3 cameras they will be, and the Nikon Z9 they already are. And the other thing I was thinking about recently that I think Nikon has an advantage going forward is that as technology moves forward, it tends to get smaller and lighter. We've seen that, like, I'll give a weird example unrelated to cameras, but like stereo speakers or speaker systems or home audio systems. In the past, we had these big, and I still have a pair of these like awesome Klipsch Forte speakers, but we had these big, huge speakers they'd sit on the floor, and they were 3 feet high and 1.5 feet wide and 1.5 feet deep, and that would push your sound. And nowadays they have these little sound bars that you can put on the front of the TV, and it fills the whole room with sound almost just as well. And I think that's an interesting fact, that like basically something that was big has been, through technology, has gotten smaller and smaller. I think the same will be true of cine cameras. Today, cine cameras are somewhat bigger than the hybrid cameras, but as time goes on, they'll be getting smaller and smaller, to the point where there'll be small cameras like the size of the hybrid cameras today. And Nikon will have put all its R&D going forward into that size camera, whereas Canon and Sony are torn by their cine lines. They have to continue to differentiate their cine lines from their hybrid lines, and they'll be putting R&D separated into the two categories, which means by the time the technologies are getting smaller, I think Nikon will be poised to be right in the game of competing with them, even at the highest levels of cinema, as time goes forward. For now, they're a hybrid camera, there's no doubt. But as time goes forward, they may well just edge right into being a cine camera as all the technologies get smaller, and that they've gotten more and more superior at the small technology. So I think Nikon going forward, 2023 and beyond, is poised to really become the premier brand. And I don't, again, mean in sales numbers. I mean in actual what you get for your money. And those that will be in the know will start moving to Nikon. Because I don't see much of a flaw in the system. Once this autofocus issue is fully put to bed, there's really no more weaknesses in Nikon that can be pointed to. Like, the critics will have to come up with something new, because they still bark and bark and bark about autofocus, but that particular criticism's already pretty much void. It's already almost irrelevant. And I suspect within 12 to 18 months at the longest, because you could argue that it's already irrelevant today, but within 12 to 18 months, Nikon's AF for stills will be every bit as good in every single way as Canon and Sony. Maybe it'll even be better. Maybe they'll hopscotch in some way, but it'll certainly be just as good. Again, keeping in mind that it's like 97, 98% of the way already right now. But everything else is either as good or better at this moment. And these new cameras haven't even come out yet. So it's a bright future for the Nikon users. Everyone who stayed with Nikon should be proud of themselves for not jumping ship too early, because I suspect some of the ship jumpers are going to be coming back, going to be swimming back off the life raft back onto the ship as it sails into the sunset. At least that's what I think. It's my prediction in advance of all the shows this year. So again, January 3rd, 2023, we'll see how this prediction stands up a year from today, 2 years from today, etc. But with that, if you're a first-time viewer, I'd love for you to subscribe. I talk a lot about Nikon, but this is photography discourse. Purpose of this channel is to talk photography. And again, I do talk Nikon a lot, but also other photography issues. I just recently did an interview with a photographer named Ronald Pollard. He's an excellent a professional photographer out of Huntsville, Alabama, and you should check that video out. It'll be posted soon, if it's not already by the time you've watched this. So if you are a first-time viewer, please subscribe, please like and share this video, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Happy New Year, and thank you for watching Photography Discourse. Peace.